Gallier House. The exteriors. The interiors they filmed across the street, across the corridor at the Herman Gruma Museum on St. Louis Street. So yes, those are not the houses you saw on TV, but this is where she actually lived. Make sure to make room for people to pass, by the way. So, let me tell you the real story of Delphine Lalaurie. The woman was born Marie Delphine McCarty in either 1775 or 1786, records vary. But we know she was born to the incredibly wealthy, incredibly powerful McCarty family. These were some of the most important citizens in the entire city of New Orleans. And dear little Delphine, well, she was stunningly beautiful. I mean, don't get me wrong, Kathy Bates is lovely, but trust me when I say Delphine Lalaurie was prettier. So, being beautiful, powerful, rich, and charismatic, of course she married young. But sadly, her first husband died mysteriously. But that's okay, because then she married again. Can you guess what happened to her second husband?
Nah.
Yeah, he died mysteriously. But at this point, Delphine had the fortune of 2 men to live on, plus her own family fortune. The woman did not need a husband. But when she was in her 50s, she finally decided to marry a third time, and she married a much younger doctor. A Dr. Leonard Lalaurie. And together, in 1831, they bought property here and built this spectacular house. And trust me when I say it is spectacular. It had everything they could need. It had ballrooms, libraries, kitchens, dining rooms. And of course, it had slave quarters. Now, slavery back in the 1830s in New Orleans was just an accepted fact. Everyone had slaves. But slavery was also very carefully controlled. New Orleans, like the rest of Louisiana, went by the French Code Noir. And historians vary. Some will say that the Code Noir was much better than other slave codes, where others say no, it was just as bad, just different. But we do know that it was very, very restrictive, both for how African Americans were allowed to be treated and how they were allowed to act. It said that all slaves had to be baptized Catholic. All slaves had to have Sundays off. They were only allowed to work 12 hours a day. But the most important aspect of the Code Noir was it said that all slaves, being good Catholics, had to be treated like good Catholics. You could not abuse them. You could not mutilate them. You could not kill them. Now, does that mean slaves in New Orleans were never hit? No. We had companies that you could hire to come to your house to beat your slaves for you, just so you would not get in trouble. But it was all very, very carefully controlled. And it seems dear little Delphine here totally missed that memo. Because within a year of moving into this house, a lawyer and a sheriff show up at her door saying, "We know what's been going on. Your neighbors have turned you in. You've been abusing your slaves." But they went in. They met the incredibly beautiful, incredibly charismatic, incredibly wealthy Delphine Lalaurie. And they left, going, "No, she's totally innocent. Who would suspect such a nice woman of such a horrible thing?" Well, less than a year later, a 12-year-old girl, a slave girl named Leah, fell from the 3rd story of the Lalaurie mansion, fell straight onto the cobblestones below, busted her head open, and died. Her body was hauled to the back courtyard and buried there, hoping to cover up this heinous crime. But, in case you've missed it, this is a very busy New Orleans street. You can't cover that sort of thing up. Once again, that lawyer and sheriff show up at her door saying, "We know what's been going on."
Bend over, it's your first time.
Their neighbors had reported that that little girl was Delphine's handmaiden. She had been brushing Delphine's hair, getting her ready for bed, and she caught a snag in Delphine's hair. And you ladies know how painful it is when somebody catches a snag in your hair. Well, Delphine's response to this was to reach down next to her, grab a whip, and start chasing this child around her house. Neighbors reported seeing the little girl chased up and down the stairs, all around the balconies, until finally the girl fell. Some neighbors even said that Delphine Lalaurie had pushed that child to her death, all for catching a snag in her hair. To make matters even worse, they had tried to cover it up, tried to bury the body and get rid of all of it. But this time Delphine was not getting off scot-free. She had all of her slaves taken away and was charged a fine, $300. That is $300 for the life of a small child. And to make things even worse, this is Delphine Lalaurie. She has never been told no in her life. She just goes down to her back courtyard, she gives money to her friends and family, puts them in her carriage, and sends them over to the slave market. She has them buy all of her slaves back. Within 24 hours, every single one of those slaves is back in this house, and nobody says a word about it. Jump ahead to 1834. Delphine Lalaurie is having a party. Everyone in the French Quarter is there, dressed up, having fun, looking fabulous. But in the middle of this party, one of Delphine's guests turns to her and says, "Delphine, I smell smoke." So of course they call the fire department. They clear the house, track down the fire, and they find the source, not unexpectedly, in the kitchens. But what they don't expect to find is there is still somebody else in that kitchen as well. She's an older slave woman, and she's chained to the stove. She was the Lalaurie's cook, and she lived her entire life, 24/7, chained to that stove, just in case Delphine Lalaurie wanted a midnight snack. And this woman looks at those firefighters and begs, "Please, help me. I started this fire in an attempt to kill myself because I'd heard I was going to be moved to the upstairs rooms that nobody ever comes back from." Neighbors went up there or the firefighters went up there, I should say, and they found horrors upstairs. Behind a barred wooden door, there were men in cages, women and children in these cages. There was a man hanging by the neck from the ceiling, with his arms and legs pulled out from his side. There was a man with a hole drilled in his head and a wooden spoon sitting next to him so that Delphine could stir his thoughts. Another man had his face slit open and the skin peeled away like an apple. And many of these slaves were still alive, still suffering through these god-awful torments. They were gathered together, marched down the stairs, and through the French Quarter over to the Cabildo to get them medical attention. And all of the good people of New Orleans, many of whom owned slaves themselves, saw this, looked out and said, "That is not okay." Within an hour, there was a mob gathered at this house, pounding on the door, demanding Delphine come out and face her punishment. But remember, this is Delphine Lalaurie. She just goes back down to her courtyard, climbs in her carriage, and rides away, never to be seen in New Orleans again. Meanwhile, one of our local papers, the New Orleans Bee, is taking this story national. They're telling the entire world that Delphine Lalaurie was doing medical experiments on her slaves. They said that one had had genital reassignment surgery done, that a woman had had her stomach slit open, her intestines pulled out through the slit, wrapped around her like a scarf, before she was sewn back up, just to see how long she would survive. They said a man had been slathered in honey and put in a box of ants, just to see how long it would take the insects to eat him alive, and more. And they even had an eyewitness, Monsieur Montril, who was a neighbor of the Lalauries and had been there when the door was broken down. And you can go online. You can read these papers yourself. But while you're there, I ask that you look at some of the other newspapers of the time as well. Because I promise you, the New Orleans Bee is the only paper of the time that prints this level of violence. All of the medical experiments, all of the worst of the tortures, is only from the New Orleans Bee. So why did the Bee print so much worse than anybody else? Well, there are some people who are going to tell you that the New Orleans Bee was the only paper brave enough to print the truth against this powerful citizen. And that might be true. I don't know. I was not alive in the 1800s. But I can tell you that the New Orleans Bee was a tabloid. It was printing the 19th century equivalent of Bat Boy Takes Manhattan, the most outrageous version of the story to sell the most outrageous number of papers. And also their eyewitness, Monsieur Montril, he was a real person. But he was also well known throughout the entire city to be a scorned suitor of Delphine's. He wanted to tap that. She was not interested. So we know he had reason to lie. But does that mean that Delphine Lalaurie is innocent? Absolutely not. We have all the other newspapers of the time saying she abused her slaves. We have the firefighter reports saying they found atrocities in this house. We have the fact that the city of New Orleans rose up against her, which they would not have done for anything short of an atrocity. And, as possibly the best evidence, we have the haunting of this house right here. Within weeks of the Laurie's disappearances, people started reporting hearing screams coming from this house. Some people say that neighbors broke in and found slaves buried in the floorboards. I don't know for sure if that is true, but what I can tell you for sure is that over the next 10 years, nobody lived in this place for more than 2 years at a time. People would buy it and either immediately start seeing ghosts, feeling ghosts, being pushed, being shoved, waking up to the sounds of people screaming and being tortured, waking up with scratches and bruises on their body. Or other people did not report ghosts. Instead, they reported strange reversals in their fortune. People who bought this house, suddenly their plantation would stop producing cotton. Their wife would run off with a butcher.